morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is the Sunday morning room on Japanese politics, one-on-one with Timothy Langley and me, Maya Matsuoka.
Everybody, thanks for joining us. We hope that this coffee time during Sunday mornings is a way to kind of keep everybody connected and to talk about what's important and why things are going on the way that they are going. So that's what I talk about, and I'd like to make it as interesting and enjoyable or intriguing for you, so that you want to continue to stay involved and listen. So going forward, it is going to be extremely active in the next maybe 5 or 6 months in Japanese politics. So if you're just dabbling, it is a good time to stay tuned and to watch what's going on, because there's a lot of action. There's even been a lot of action since the last time we talked to now. So I'll try and give you an update on that, and also give you a little bit of insight to what's coming down the path. But for the next couple of months until probably October, a lot will be happening, and you might be in for some surprises. So to be the smart one in your group talking about Japanese politics, just stay tuned. It's a lot of interesting stuff. Let me talk about what's going on of most importance today, and then let me talk about some things that have a bigger impact, but not today. Today is important because it is an election day for three regions that are having by-elections. It means that whoever was sitting in the seat gave up the ghost. They died, or they moved on, or they were kicked out, or they resigned over the last 3 months, and those by-elections are happening today. That's going on in Hiroshima, in Nagano, and in Hokkaido. 2 upper house seats and 1 lower house seat. And you might think that in the grand context, that's just 3 seats, what's the big deal? And it's a big deal because it is a kind of a precursor to what the opposition parties are going to be doing, the issues that they're going to be talking about when the general election happens. And there will be a general election. Constitutionally, it is required between now and September 25th. And that means the lower house, the entire lower house, all of the members need to go up for election or re-election. And the LDP has currently a significant majority in the lower house because of its coalition with Komeito. So it can pretty much dictate how laws are passed, how the machinery of government moves in the lower house. In the upper house, it similarly has a majority because of its coalition, but it's rather thin. So if they didn't have the coalition, they would be in trouble. But they have the coalition, and they need to preserve that coalition by making sure that they scratch Komeito's back, and in return, Komeito supports the LDP. So in these 3 elections, it's interesting to watch what Komeito and the LDP are doing together to support their candidates, and what the opposition parties are doing. Are they joining hands? Are they coalescing votes? Are they standing behind candidates who might be distasteful to them? At least they're not the LDP candidate. And so this is important to watch. The election is going on today, so it's kind of a news blackout while the election is going on. And the results will start pouring in. And in the television news tonight, probably around 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, you might have winners announced, but the news will start pouring in. Let me tell you about why the 3 are important. Hokkaido, Nagano, and Hiroshima. Let me start with the easiest one to talk about. That's Hokkaido. Hokkaido, the fellow who was there was a former agricultural minister, LDP, and he had to resign because of a bribery scandal. So he resigned. He wasn't arrested because of his age and that sort of thing, but the LDP looked really bad in Hokkaido, in the district that he would be running in. And it's kind of so bad that the LDP decided they're not going to run a candidate there. So the LDP is not going to have a candidate in Hokkaido. So that means that there's one seat that is going to change hands because the fellow who was there, who was taking the bribery money from the egg producer in Akita, is one less seat for the LDP. So it's incumbent on the LDP to do better in the next two election districts. The second one that's pretty easy to talk about too is Nagano. Nagano, the LDP has a candidate as a former bureaucrat, so he's an LDP person, but he's running against a fellow by the name of Hata, who is the son of one of the former prime ministers, but it's not an LDP prime minister. So he's pretty strong there. He died. He gave it to his eldest son. His eldest son passed away because of COVID, and so his son is going to be, his brother is going to be running as a candidate for the Constitutional Democratic Party. The LDP is unlikely to do well there because of the sympathy vote and the fact that Hata, did a lot for the district, and he is well remembered and relied upon. So that's 2 out of 3. And let's move to the next one, Hiroshima, a little bit more complicated there. The reason why the Hiroshima seat is open is because the upper house member who held the seat was arrested for buying bribes. So you've got bribery in Hokkaido, you've got bribery in Hiroshima. So it's money and politics. That is the war cry of the opposition party against letting the LDP swoop in yet again. And the more damaging part of, or the difficulty with Hiroshima is that not only was she convicted of bribery and had to give up her badge, her husband was too. Her husband was in the same election district. A former minister of justice received a lot of money from, it is said, from the LDP and from Mr. Abe and Mr. Suga. So it's an uphill battle there. Not only is it an uphill battle for the LDP to come in and retake that position after the former holder of the seat was ejected for bribery, but Mr. Suga has not been in Hiroshima or Nagano or Hokkaido to campaign on behalf of his supporters to get that seat. So it's almost as if they've decided it's not worth the juice. The election district of Hiroshima is under Mr. Kishida's oversight. He is also from the region, and it is his responsibility to make sure that candidates in the LDP do well there. He's under a lot of strain. He, you might remember, was a candidate for the prime ministership, and probably that was the pinnacle of his political power, and he's been diminished ever since then. There's going to be an election for prime minister in October for Mr. Suga, who is living out the last remaining months of the term that he inherited from Mr. Abe. And Mr. Kishida wants to be a candidate. If Hiroshima doesn't do well, it's really the end of Kishida's potential candidacy. So for people who are watching and thinking, who are the candidates, he would have been one. Mr. Suga is potentially one. Kono Taro is talked about a lot. 30% of the population thinks he would make a good prime minister. So there's a lot of movement going on at that level. So today, watch out for the election results that will be coming out later in the evening.
Timothy, I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you. Would you like to open the room for questions after the topic? Yes.
Sure. So that's the election part there. I'm going to shift over. I'm going to talk about COVID. I'm going to talk about the Suga elections and the Olympics. So those are the four things I'm going to focus on today. Try and get through those quickly, but I'd like to open it up for questions now on just that part. And if there are no questions or comments, then we'll just move on to the COVID situation. Okay, moving on to COVID. So there was a call for a new state of emergency earlier in the week. It was announced, the words started to come out maybe on Tuesday. It became more concrete on Wednesday. And then there was an announcement on Thursday, Friday, to go into effect tonight or tomorrow. I believe tomorrow. It's going to be a short state of emergency until the 17th. And therefore, you know, throwing cold water on Golden Week. But I think that it's obvious it's going to be extended after that. So it's kind of like the Chinese water torture of drip, drip, dripping. It's obvious that just the short state of emergency is not going to do the trick, because it takes as long as this new state of emergency is for the government to see what the results were. So they start the lockdown type restrictions. They don't see the result of that in the numbers for about 2 weeks. And to tell you the truth, they should have moved much more quickly earlier, but they were afraid because of the impact it would potentially cause to the Olympics. You've seen the numbers in Osaka being so high, but not reflected in the numbers for Tokyo, and you wouldn't be criticized for scratching your head and wondering why, because those numbers were kept artificially down so that we could preserve some aspect of, you know, having the Olympics and having you know, the COVID rollout, and things just conspired to push the government into the decision that they had to make. I predicted when, or if they called the state of emergency, that it would kill the Olympics. But I've since come to appreciate how much the LDP needs and wants the Olympics to happen no matter what, even if there are no spectators, even if at one point 2 weeks ago, they were talking about maybe 50% of the spectators' capacity. That lasted for a week, and then they came to the conclusion that no spectators for the Olympics. And I think the forces that want the Olympics are basically tied to, you know, the big corporations and the people who invested heavily in it, including, you know, the Japanese national government, but also Tokyo too. So Tokyo is straddled with much of the debt and much of the money, and if the spectators and the television rights don't pan out, people are going to lose a lot of money. So I think that's underpinning it. And I think that the decision is, you know, it's not about saving lives or preventing the expansion of the infection. It is just, we've got to make some money off of this. But I think, and we'll know a little bit more next week, or maybe in 2 weeks, actually, it'll take a little bit more time, whether they will actually cancel the Olympics. I think, depending on this new state of emergency, if it's extended, that will look pretty bad. I think the government will actually have to say, let's make, you know, the Winter Olympics of 2022 followed by the Summer Olympics of 2022 and make the best out of it. I think we're heading to that scenario. So it's something to keep an eye on. There's a controversy that you might have followed. A lot of people are saying, you know, I heard that the vaccines will be rolling out by maybe September. And then I heard there was another powerful person, I don't know what his name is, and he said it wouldn't be until spring of next year. So the two people who are having this little competition are Taro Kano, who is the vaccine rollout czar. He was named by Suga as soon as Suga took over the prime ministership. And the other fellow is a fellow by the name of Shimomura. He is, he's very influential in LDP politics. He's a little bit older than Kono, and he wants to be prime minister. He doesn't state it as explicitly as Kono does, for maybe reasons of diplomacy and decorum, but he has floated the idea that he would be available. He is also from the largest faction in the LDP, the Hosoda faction. Konotaro is not a faction leader. Neither is Shimomura, but Shimomura, the faction leader of the Hosoda faction, is basically Mr. Abe. When he resigned as prime minister, you're not supposed to have a faction or a party affiliation. Now that he's free, he can go back to his faction, and so he's basically the faction leader. And if he blesses Shimomura as the candidate, then it could be possibly a race between Shimomura and Kono. That's a complication that I'll talk about later, so I just don't want to get into that. I'm talking about our COVID right now. But they're both trying to one up the other, so that Mr. Shimomura is looking at Kono's approval ratings and his popularity and trying to yank him down a couple of notches so that he looks better by comparison. You've seen that before. So I think that's about it for COVID. You can expect COVID to be extended after the first preliminary round. That's my assessment of that. I'd like to open it up for questions or comments. And if not, then I'm going to talk about Suga elections and the Olympics. And then we can have a wider open discussion on lots of different things. Oh man, how are you doing?
Hi Tim, good morning. How are you? I'm good. Hi, just a question. You mentioned about 5 minutes ago the numbers of active COVID cases between Osaka and Tokyo. And I think the words to the effect was Tokyo was being artificially kept lower for Olympic reasons. Can you provide a little more commentary around the artificially kept lower and potentially some proof?
No,
Statement?
no, I can't, because then I don't have the proof of that. But if you look at the numbers, there's no logical reason to explain it. The people in Osaka are not genetically different from the people in Tokyo. And the way a business is run is not so dramatically different that it would explain why those numbers are so different. They have a great governor in Osaka who is very much dedicated, as is Koike, but the numbers are just different. And in explaining that, you've got to evaluate, who wins and who loses and what's the big difference. And I think with the new emergency that was kind of launched quickly, it wasn't much of a discussion, although the numbers were creeping up. All of a sudden it just tumbled in. So I think it's like, I don't know, like a lot of things, like the Kennedy assassination or whatever. It just takes a couple of years to figure it out, look at the what actually happened as compared to what the public perception was, and reaching a conclusion. But anyway, that's my assessment of how those numbers grew like that.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's somewhat conspiratorial, but
yeah, it was sounding a bit fashionable as opposed to, I'm not sure.
Yep. But it's a big deal, if we're not going to hold the Olympics, and the reason why we're not going to hold the Olympics is because of the perception that Japan is not a safe place to send the athletes. Somebody's got to pay for that. So, and you can see that they're just really striving to preserve the possibility of keeping the Olympics. So that news will leak out. Mr. Nikai said, well, maybe we'll postpone the Olympics. He said that 2 weeks ago. Caused a huge storm. Moving on. Hello, Om. You've got something?
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Hey, sorry about that. I actually got cut out for a second, so you may have answered this question, but I was a little curious as to what sort of posturing you had seen in terms of placing blame more than taking credit for considering things may go poorly.
So there's when you're talking about blame, there's basically two pockets to look at. One is, it's your guys' fault. You're out drinking, you're not wearing your mask, it's you guys, right? It's the general population. You're pointing your fingers at everybody else. And the other option is to say, it's our fault. We didn't evaluate it quickly enough. We didn't know that, we didn't think that you'd have to have a doctor to administer the vaccines. We just forgot that the rule is you're supposed to have a doctor for every 4 nurses, and dentists can't do injections. And we didn't have enough vaccine because we didn't negotiate adroitly enough with Pfizer. And it took the prime minister to go to Washington, D.C. to talk to the president of all of these things. But whoever's controlling the narrative, one of the criticisms that many people have of contemporary Japanese mass media is that the LDP controls the story. So there is a lot of truth to that. Democracy in action here in Japan is largely controlled by what the central government wants it to be. So if somebody's going to be blamed, it's typically not going to be the Japanese government or the rollout of the vaccines or the number of cases of vaccine that are distributed, that sort of thing. It's going to be more like you guys are drinking too much, and that's why we're not going to hold the Olympics. But the general population of Japan, close to 90%, are not interested in having the Olympics. They're sick of it, and they just want to move on. They want to get COVID done and get back to doing business.
Yeah, I find it interesting what you're saying, because that the media report that the Pfizer CEO refused to speak to anyone but the prime minister struck me as odd. That I can't imagine that actually be the position of the CEO. So it did seem to have some sort of spin that I didn't quite understand.
That's a great observation. For those people that don't know, there's a lot going on in the background with the vaccines, the vaccine distribution, the allotment that Japan is getting. A lot of people are saying, it's because of the EU restrictions and the trade, and it's not. There's something else going on in the background. And why in the world would press reports come out that said, Mr. Konotaro, who is the czar for vaccine rollout, in his attempt to speak with the Pfizer CEO about the issue, was refused. And the story was, I'm not going to talk to anybody except the prime minister. I mean, it sounds a little bit weird and strange. So there's something going on, and I suspect it has to do with the IP and the transitioning of Pfizer IP to Japan, or the production capabilities. Japan has production capabilities. Why purchase it from Brussels? Why not shift the production here? We're going to produce, several million doses. And the Pfizer president said just this week, it's probably going to take a third injection. And maybe we have to do this every year. So it is in Japan's best interest to move production here. So I think there's a big fight going on with the transfer of technology and the production facilities being utilized here. I think it's a huge fight, and that's one of the reasons in the background why it's not making the progress that we would have thought. It's all very secret. It's all very quiet. We're not going to know, like I said earlier, until we have a little bit of time, maybe a couple of years for reflection, to find out what the real story is. But it's not the story that I think we're being told now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Om. Anybody else? Let's move on.
Let's move on.
Okay, So let's talk about Mr. Suga. Mr. Suga's election prospects or his standing. He's actually his ratings in among the Japanese population is beginning to plateau out. It's a little bit over 40%, which is not bad. It would be nicer if he was more greatly loved and respected and admired, but he's kind of not that charismatic kind of person. And the Biden visit was not full of a lot of excitement or slaps on the backs or tumbling into sand traps on golf courses. And it was a short visit. But they did talk about things of great, geopolitical importance, great importance to the president of the United States, which is basically climate. He's really thrown his weight to climate change and has extracted concessions from Japan. You'll remember Biden and Suga met. Biden comes back, and then Mr. Suga announces the rollout for being carbon neutral. It was going to be 50% by 2050. He's rolled that back. It's going to be 2030 now. We're going to really cut, and we're going to coalesce with the United States on bringing the carbon footprint down and cease global warming, that sort of thing. So those are important announcements, and they're gained as a kind of concession. And part of the other concessions are, what are we going to do about China? And the China situation is complicated by the moves on Taiwan. So there's a lot of saber rattling between China and Taiwan, and the United States doesn't want anything to happen there. And of course, the Japanese, who depend on the free flow of trade, don't want a conflict in this region. And it looks like it's going to happen whether we want it to or not. The Chinese are too hell-bent on reuniting the rebel province of Taiwan back into the mother fold. And a lot of wargaming is going on, a lot of posturing and feints are going on just to keep the tension high. So the problem with Japan is it has a war-renouncing constitution. It is attempting to beef up its military, but even with the United States and Japan combined, if China really wants to move on Taiwan, they'll be able to do it successfully. It's just what's the political repercussions from that. So it's not anticipated to be something that's going to happen within the next 2 years. There's too many other things going on, but with the anniversary of the Chinese Revolution coming up, it might present an opportunity for them to reassert themselves as the dominant player. They're moving on with their currency. They've launched a Bitcoin type of a currency to knock the United States off of the dollar-denominated global economy. So there's a lot going on there. One of the things that the United States insists Japan to do is carry more weight, pay for more soldiers, purchase more military hardware, that sort of thing. And so it's interesting that Mr. Abe, who you might remember was prime minister until just very recently, has now appointed himself as chief czar of the Constitutional Revision Committee. He has always been dedicated to making Japan a strong player in the region and to change Article 9 that allows Japan to get out from under the U.S. nuclear umbrella and establish its own right to defend itself, to project its power throughout the region, which of course the Koreans don't like, the Singaporeans don't like, the people in the region just don't like. So fixing those types of relationships to allow Japan to hold more military power is a dream of Mr. Abe. And that is important to reflect on when we talk about Mr. Abe's potential comeback at the end of the Suga administration. And since Mr. Suga became prime minister as a consequence of Mr. Abe, as Mr. Abe's protege, it is not a stretch for Mr. Abe to say, you know, I've taken a break now, and all of the bad stuff that could happen, we've all crammed into your administration, Mr. Suga. Thank you very much. We've got a clean slate now. People aren't talking about Sakuro Mirukai or Dake Mondai or all of these scandals that I was involved in. I've been out for a year, so now it's time for me to come back and save the day. That is a very likely prospect. You might also recall Mr. Suga has been pretty quiet geopolitically in Japan. He hasn't traveled much. His first trip was to go to visit with Mr. Biden last week, 3 days, came back, the climate summit, and then he was going to go to the Philippines and India. That has just been canceled. That was canceled 2 days ago, and that was going to be his next big push, the friendship and the Quad and the reaction to the Chinese incursions and the island building, that sort of thing has been canceled. So once again, the COVID reaction, the response of the government to COVID is taking precedence over everything else. But even in light of that, the Japan-U.S. relationship is the foundation for Japan standing in the region. And so there is a lot of tit-for-tat that's going on there. I think with that, I'd like to close that up and ask if there are any questions. Evan.
Thank you, Timothy.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'd actually wanted to ask a question, but missed my window on the earlier topic there.
It's okay.
Well, I'll circle back to it briefly then. I think that there's a lot of data showing that there's some, protectionism sort of being put in place in order for Fujifilm to catch up with its virus vaccine-related production. So we see that currently there are over 200 Fujifilm employees being trained on vaccine production in Texas. I think it's the move there with Pfizer. It's just trying to get the IP, as you say, in place, because this is big business. Vaccine production will go on, for decades potentially. So I think this is, my personal opinion, I should say, is that there are some actual business reasons for this delay. Obviously, one could argue that that's being offset by the damage to the overall economy, but I think that is a part of it. So I just wanted to put that comment in there. I do have another comment about the conflict with Taiwan as well, but maybe I'll pause for a second to see if anybody has any comments on the Fujifilm theory that I have.
Well, the grand conspiracy spokesperson just signed on, Hayato. I'm sure he's got something to say about that. Hayato?
Yeah, okay. So that was, at this time, I'm pretty sure, my colleagues are pretty sure that this Japan has been intentionally delaying, the vaccine process to help make money mainly for this Takeda, right? And which is in the middle of clinical trial, as well as the Fujifilm is also coming, right? Yeah. So for that, because as you know, Japan has a less than 1% vaccination rate,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no chance that Japan. And then those vaccines are only good for 6 months, so we have to go and do the next vaccine later this year. Even we are done now, right? Yeah. So yesterday I was talking to this friend of mine who is the head of the government affairs at the SOPAN. Yeah, and we were kind of agreement that this is that all the intelligence or everything, all the information suggests that this has been intentionally sabotaged by Takeda and the Minister of Health, intentionally, so that Takeda make money. Takeda can make, 10 billion or 20 billion a year, just doing the vaccine every year, Yeah, so for them, this is very important, right? And they definitely don't care about Pfizer, right? Yeah, because Japanese bureaucrats, they have to, they have to get re-employed by those Japanese drug companies. Pfizer may not hire them, right? Yeah, so I think that's my kind of view there. And also, and I kind of came up on another comment, which was, there was an effort formed for re-election of, Mr. Abe to be the prime minister in the future. Right? So now that we kind of have a official kind of kickoff on, start raising money for his re-election, right? He may or may not be the next one, right? A strong contender is obviously the Taro, right? Who is very popular now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's my kind of update, right? And I'm done talking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Hayato being a Japan national, it's easier for you to make observations and comments like that. I'm reluctant to, it's difficult to figure these things out. I kind of don't see that it's as bad as you paint it, but there is something going on and requires a bit more explanation and facilities being here in Japan. And wouldn't Japan love to be an exporter of vaccines rather than a purchaser of vaccines that are produced elsewhere, and having that needed outflow of cash rather than the inflow of cash and the export of goods and services, which the Japanese, excel at. So it has a certain amount of logic to it.
Timothy, that's what the people will say publicly, but that's not what those people think, right? Because the guys are working for bureaucrats. They kind of are looking for the next pay for themselves, right? Everybody's out for themselves. So for that, they can talk of a beautiful story, but that's not how those guys really work in reality. And there's a lot of money here for everybody.
That's true, but on a global standard, the Japanese bureaucrats are highly evaluated as being, at the patriotic level. There are few places where Japanese who really feel for their country and love their country and want to express that. The pinnacle of that expression is in joining the bureaucracy. So for kids who are graduating from college, the number one job market for them is to join the bureaucracy. It's not joining the self-defense forces or even joining Dentsu. It's so the level and the quality of those people, I think, is very high. So it's hard to ascribe nefarious motivations to them. It's easier to ascribe that to the corporations that want to generate the money, but also with certain ministries that are dedicated to enhancing Japanese prowess in manufacturing and in export related trade. So there is some of that going on, but boy, you don't want that to become more than just a conspiracy theory that's talked about in Bunshun, because that would really cause a disaster for the LDP, and they're already in a little bit of trouble, as we talked about, for elections. So in the very near term, you're going to see a lot of posturing. So, for example, this new idea for the Ministry of Kids, you might have heard of, that's roundly criticized as just an election ploy, that it really doesn't have a lot of push behind it. But the LDP is hoping that people will see that the LDP has a heart and it's concerned about the people and the population. But I think it can rightly be evaluated as, where the hell was this idea earlier? And now with elections looming, elections are looming for the lower house. So how does the LDP portray itself in a good light when the Olympics are going to be less than what anybody wanted them to be, that the rollout of the vaccines is not good, that Mr. Suga is not doing so great. There's just not much good to look at to say, yes, the LDP is the power of our choice because they've done such great things for us.
Well, now you answer the question why the Mr. Abe may not be the next prime minister, because he does not want to walk into the current environment where he will be responsible. So he may push that Kono Taro to be responsible before he shows up.
I don't think so. I think if he's going to make his move, he's going to do it now. He's 68 years old. He's still young by prime minister standards, and you know he resigned because of quote unquote health issues. But I think the job itself is just a tough job, and he's not. He doesn't have that kind of constitution for being a prime minister. Hasn't had that kind of training. He comes from a family of hereditary politicians. But I think it's given the benefit of the doubt, it is a tough job, and probably exhaustion set in. He did have some medical issues, but I think that the best scenario, the scenario that looks the best to me, even though I don't have a horse in the race, is Mr. Abe coming out of retirement to be prime minister again. He is the leader of the largest political faction, and Mr. Aso, who serves as finance minister and also as deputy prime minister, a very powerful, influential politician. His go-to guy is Kono Taro. Kono Taro he's not the leader of the faction, but with Mr. Aso's weight behind it, he makes a very viable candidate. But there's no way that he could defeat Mr. Abe if Mr. Abe decided to run. In fact, Mr. Suga could not withstand that. So you'll see more and more of this movement going on. Maybe part of the trial balloon was Mr. Abe unilaterally claiming that he is the chief advisor for the Constitutional Revision Committee within the LDP. To see what the press said about it, or what pundits are analyzing about that. But you'll see more and more of this, him coming out of the closet, him being quoted and remarking and on political issues. I think we can anticipate that. And so as that comes up, then the prospect of him becoming a candidate becomes pretty much unmistakable. But a lot is left to be seen. If Mr. Suga decides that he's going to be the candidate, he wants to maintain the position after the lower house elections, it does knock out other people who potentially could be candidates. If he's going to be the candidate, then Kono Taro cannot be a candidate because he's a member of his cabinet, and that would be really bad politics for him to do that. So he would have to resign his position as a minister in order to run independently, while his boss is still finance minister. That doesn't look very good either. So there's a lot of calculus going on, and you'll see this being revealed probably after the Olympics. Once the Olympics is beyond us, there's a brief little bit of time that the prime minister could close down the lower house on his own volition, but it's more likely that it will run its course, and in September we'll have that election, and then the LDP will have an election for the prime minister.
Thank you, Timothy and Hayato. If I could, I wanted to go to the second point that I'd raised my hand about, which was the conflict with Taiwan and its potential ramifications on the Japanese Constitution. So we see that Admiral Davidson recently gave a 6-year window for what he sees as the imminent invasion of Taiwan. We see a few other, of the U.S. military warning about the same thing. If that were to happen, I'm curious, first of all, what would that look like? Would it mean that Taiwan becomes more controlled in the same way that Hong Kong is becoming more controlled, more influence of, essentially CCP rather, sorry, basically the politicians that control the island being put in place by the communist government. And then if that happens, would it mean a complete loss of independence by Taiwan or just a change in the political structure? And with that conflict happening, would it give, Abe and the rest who are pushing for this change to the constitution the necessary weight that they need to push that change through, and have Japan essentially be able to not just defend itself, but also engage in these type of conflicts?
There are other people that are more closely involved and engaged in that area than I am here in this room. But what's going on in Hong Kong is a kind of a slow boil. They have come in now and teaching the kids, what it's like to be a part of the greater communist state, and singing the national anthem and that sort of thing. That's going on now. It's starting at the school age to indoctrinate the kids into the new reality. In Taiwan, on the other hand, it's just a tripwire. It's not kind of a slow boil there. It's either all or nothing. And so when it happens in Taiwan, it will be a major, the United States will more likely go to the aid of Taiwan. And Japan, under the U.S. Defense Treaty, is obliged to provide support. And there's also stationing of warships and troops and ammunition here in Japan. So Japan becomes a viable participant and a potential target. But if the Chinese want to do that, they can do it. It's just going to take time, but it could roll into a major conflagration, which would involve North Korea, Myanmar, India, the whole thing with the Quad coming up. If it happens, it's going to. Mr. Abe is not going to be around during that period of time, but maybe the impact of him changing the constitution so there's more defense capabilities and less of a reliance on the United States. I think that's a likely scenario, depending on Mr. Abe's success in doing that. There might be other people in the room that would like to contribute or give a more maybe stark assessment. Go ahead.
Yes, and if anybody else is an authority in this field, I'm very curious if, as you say, it is all or nothing conflict. How is that logistically possible? Just to cross the distance between China and Taiwan, it's a huge distance. How would you move troops across that distance? You'd have to control the entire airspace. You'd have to have perfect weather conditions. You've only got a few times of year when the sea state makes it even possible to move troops across. So I'm just curious if anybody understands what the logistics of that would look like.
Well, I don't remember all the details right now, but there was some kind of simulation case study, as the U.S. military or their think tank has been playing as to how the China is going to come at the Taiwan. Right? And so generally speaking, so if the Chinese, say, show up at the shore over the Taiwan, they're going to need, 250,000 to 500,000 troops to try to capture the Taiwan. And right now in Japan, Okinawa, we have a 50,000 U.S. Marine, ready to go right now. Right. So if there's any move to come to Taiwan, and they're going to be shipped out right away to Taiwan to do this beachfront battle against the Chinese, right? Yeah, so but the U.S. has been really wanted to do this, right, for a while, at least since the Singapore crisis, you know. So that was like a 2012, I think, you know. Yeah. So for U.S., because the U.S. has, you know, more like you know, superiority in the air and the sea, right? So the U.S. would like very much to go into the battle with China in Taiwan, right, instead of North Korea or Myanmar, right? Because the Chinese has a 10 million army. So the only weakness that the U.S. is going to see against China is having to go and battle with this Chinese army with 10 million people, 10 million soldiers now, right? They have reserve another 15 million. Yeah, so the U.S. only have 1 million troops, so they don't want to fight against the 25 million, you know, Chinese, you know. Yeah, so that was I don't know if it's going to play other way, but that has been a simulation, right? So for that, U.S. really love to fight, you know, in Taiwan, because the U.S. going to win, right? Because then again, China, the only another superiority that China has is 80,000 plus missiles, right? Yeah, so they'll come and try to target at the U.S. military base here in Japan, right? Yeah, so maybe we're going to have a lot of the bombing here. Let's see what happens. I'm done talking.
Yeah. So that just talking about that, your mind begins to swell, your head begins to swell at what the implications are of that. You know, war. It would trigger, you know, a war. The United States is honor bound to protect Taiwan. The Japanese are honor bound and treaty bound to support the United States. The growth and the encroachment of the Chinese throughout the Indochina, the sea lanes here in between, you know, Japan and the Philippines is growing, and the growth of their air force and military. I mean, every year it grows the equivalent of the entire defense budget of France, for example, and that's been going on for 10 years. So it's not a fight that anybody wants to trigger, which is precisely why the issue of the Quad talks. So Quad was initiated during the Trump administration, but was not very robust or fruitful. The joining of forces of Australia, the United States, India, and Japan as a kind of a bulwark against China. But now under the Biden administration, that is receiving a lot of attention. They had their first heads of state meeting last week to talk about that, and that's a worrying thing for China. So hopefully it's like mutually assured destruction. If you do that, then you know you've got maybe the Australians don't scare the pants off of anybody, but India sure should. India and the United States and Japan working in concert should be a pretty significant deterrent. But by all you know, analysis, you know, China is hell bent on reuniting, making China one country, and getting their piece of vengeance from the people who escaped China and set up in a province, their own country, and took all of the art and the wealth from a country that was in the throes of a revolution and parking it. You know, there's just a lot of political and emotional energy that's devoted to that. So let's hope for the best, but continue to watch it carefully. Finally, let's talk about the Olympics. This is the last part of my presentation, and gosh, we've pretty much run out of time, but I would like to open it up for more questions. So it does remain to be seen whether the Olympics will be held here or not, what it will look like. As I said earlier, in conjunction with COVID and with the Suga elections, it is going to be extremely difficult for the Japanese to pull out of the Olympics. but it might be the right choice. But as we were talking about with the distribution of COVID vaccines and the desire of the Japanese to bring production here and have IP here, kind of damn the torpedoes, if people are going to die, that's kind of part of the price of it. But we want production here. We want IP here. We want Takeda to be, to be the producer of a better vaccine that is, more effective, and people all over the world want it. For the Olympics to be held, I think it's a very tough decision for the Japanese government, and they're just very reluctant to pull the plug on it. Too much money will be lost. Too many businesses who have banked on it will suffer. And it's, the way politics is run here, people vote, but companies also vote. When companies have stated, pretty effectively to the people who are their employees that they support a certain candidate or a certain political party, people fall in line. So I don't think that's as heavily replicated in other countries. For example, the United States, people are more independently minded. They're Democrats and Republicans in every kind of walk of life. But here in Japan, what the boss says, what the CEO says, and he's got his picture in the paper with a certain politician, people get the message. And when it comes time to vote, those block votings are very effective. So the Olympics going, not going, I don't think we're going to have that answer, but we will have it in probably 2 weeks' time. So stay tuned to that. And we'll keep hitting that topic every time we get together on Sunday mornings. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to the Olympics discussion, and also anything else. We can go a little bit over time if that's okay with you, Maya.
Yes, everybody, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll let you up on stage to talk about it. And Timothy, I have a question to you before the other people get up here. So we often, or now the narrative or the discussion is about canceling the Olympics, and that it seems that the general perception is that this depends on the Japanese government. So the final decision will be made by the Japanese government. But I think that there is also one more factor, and then this decision can be made also by the International Olympic Committee, right? And we are not talking about this option at all. So I just wondered why it happens and why all the burden, so to speak, is put on the shoulders of the Japanese government here.
Okay, so this comes up from time to time, that the Olympic Committee really is the one that's going to decide. And actually, when you talk to the Olympic Committee, they say, no, we're waiting for Japan. Japan is the one that, they are the host country. And what they say carries lots of weight. We're not the one that dictates that. The Japanese government, for their own purposes, will say that. They're the boogeyman. They're the ones that are holding things up. But I think if the question was put to the Olympic Committee, they would shrug their shoulders and say, oh, we haven't gotten that phone call yet. So I think this decision is wholly on the shoulders of the LDP, and the LDP will say, things like, the Olympic Committee is, they haven't told us what we can do, or that sort of thing, only as an escape clause. I don't think it's really, it doesn't make much sense to me, not on this issue.
Thank you.
We've got Gary in the house. Tim.
Good morning.
Good morning, Gary.
We
missed you last week.
I was busy and I do apologize, and I'm happy that I'm working. Anyway, thank you for welcoming me, and thank you for once again having this discussion. I'd like to open up, and I'm speculating here, and I'd like to get your perspective on it. The old tale about the three Japanese leaders, Oda, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, talking about a nightingale who refuses to sing. And of course, Oda says, kill it. Hideyoshi says, talk to it. And Ieyasu says, wait. And it seems to me that Ieyasu, with his family's long history of running the country, with that philosophy of wait, has really infused itself into the psyche. So that has a direct reflection on the Olympics and on the COVID vaccine rollout. It always seems that they're waiting, and it's been there's been disasters that have been whose effect has been multiplied because of this waiting. The Kobe earthquake, the Hanshin earthquake, the Fukushima nuclear power plants explosions. It seems to me that the tendency to wait has had a tremendously poor effect on the outcome, and I'd like your comments on that.
Okay, I'm sure other people have something to say about that too. Let me just comment that there is, for example, a poison. There's an antidote for this tendency among the Japanese to wait and to see what happens. And this antidote, it's kind of a one size fits all. It's called shogunai, and that shifts the blame from human actors to the gods of fate. So it can't be helped. So it's not my fault, even though I was responsible for it politically. It's kind of shogunai. So you hear that over and over and over again, and it is kind of like forgiveness. It's it's not my fault. It's God's fault, or God decided to do it that way. But I think you're absolutely correct that one tactic is just to wait, see what happens. And even between the weekly times that we have this conversation, so much happens within a week that, no matter how much energy a human puts into something, sometimes things overtake it. Mr. Suga went to Washington, D.C. hoping to have a slap on the back and, maybe pitch a ball with Joe Biden, and it didn't quite work out. It wasn't what he wanted, and now he's not going to India and the Philippines. He's just got so much going on against him. So sometimes you can't carve those things out. Other comments from people?
I agree, and it's just very frustrating to see. And I understand the shogunai. I also like the Aruga Mama idea too. In fact, I embrace that to accept reality for what it is.
It's always great to have you on the program, Gary. Thank you.
You're
Andy,
very
did you
kind.
have something?
Andy?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
And I have one simple question. And after the Tokyo Olympics, do you think international tourism will be recovered in Japan? Because now it seems Japan closed the borders to stop the international tourists coming to Japan as well. So I would like to know, after Olympic, will the tourism market will be recovered?
That's a great question, and that falls into Maya's bailiwick. Maya is a professional in tourism. She's sitting in a pretty position within the Japanese government on observing that. So I defer to Maya.
Thank you. Yes, this is a very valid question. And basically in the travel industry here, a lot of people actually hoped that the Olympics would be the first event which would be open for international visitors to Japan. But since they decided that it would be held without any audiences, first international audiences, and then without Japanese audiences. So this timeline has been postponed, and I think that all the things, of course, there will be a huge demand for Japan once the pandemic is over. But this depends, the time when Japan will be open again for international travelers will depend on a number of factors. It will be, of course, the vaccination program. It will be also the negotiations of the Japanese government with the governments of other countries, source markets for Japan, because in the very beginning, soon after the pandemic is over or the borders are open for international travel will resume on the basis of bilateral agreements. And well, I'm sure that a lot of people here in the room are aware that well, when it comes, to taking risk and opening the borders, with certain countries, the Japanese government and the ministries in charge of this are very careful. They are not quick to do it. They like to actually check the facts and, be on the safe side of everything. So yes, there will be international travel. It will start slowly, and well, the general expectation at the moment is that probably by the end of 2023, it will be more or less at 50% of what it was in 2019. But of course, as things change so quickly and unexpectedly, this timeline could change as well. So I don't know if this answers your question, but that's more or less what we know at the moment, at what we expect at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just build on that. Somebody else might have something to say, but this is what I predict. I predict that after we emerge from COVID, if you believe Mr. Kono or if you believe Mr. Shimomura, it's going to happen eventually. Japan will experience something akin to what the United States went through in the roaring 20s. It will be party central. There will be a lot of travel. Japan will be cool again. And a lot of wealth will be generated and a lot of children produced. The lid that's been put on just the Japanese consumers and Japanese population is one issue, but in the region as well. So the number of Chinese millennials, there's great affection for Japan in China. People love to come here, and typically when they make a trip, not only do they buy everything in sight, but they also come back. The vast majority come back for a second visit. And the population of millennials who have the wealth or their parents' wealth and the ability to make that kind of travel will be just explosive. And just as evidence of that, the Prime Minister announced on Thursday that we were going to go into another state of emergency, and that would be initiated on Sunday night and Monday morning. And you look at this town going crazy Friday, and particularly last night. Everybody's out getting that last drink in with their friends. They're out carousing. It's human nature that once this is lifted off of us, Japan will be cool again, and I think we will be flooded with tourists, and there will be a lot of excitement to be had then.
Yes, that's true. And also the Japanese government is, and well, the relevant ministries, they're actually, building on building a program of international events. So there is, a lot coming up, international meetings. And of course, many of the meetings will be hybrid meetings in the beginning, but well, human nature, we are people, we like to socialize in person in real time. So eventually, once, the memory of and the shock of COVID is, well, I wouldn't say it's over, but once, it is, well, softened somehow by time, yeah, there will be a lot of events. There will be international travel, inbound travel from many countries, South Korea as well, and Southeast Asia as well, and of course from the European countries and United States.
So we're kind of wrapping up. We're a little bit running over time, but we're not it's not a hard stop at the 9 o'clock hour, but as long as there's a conversation and value to be shared, the room will stay open. But we're kind of petering out now. Before Maya closes up the room with a couple of announcements and what she does when she's generally closing down the room, if you have comments about things that you'd like particularly to be covered in the next room, which will be a week from today, go and we listen to what is interesting for you, and plus it will help me tee it up so that I have a little bit better intel and justifications for stances that I might take on what the Japanese government is doing. So I'd like to open that up too. So let's go ahead and have an open dialogue, and Maya, when it's time, just weigh in. Stephen? Okay.
Yes, hi Tim, hi Maya. It was a pleasure to hear you guys in the morning. The question I have is with regards to the COVID prevention message that the government is sending to people, because I feel like now after over a year of COVID, we kind of all learned how to live with it, and that my observation is that people are more or less comfortable to live in this environment, just as long as you put a mask, you wash your hands. I feel today people are going back to their regular routine. So I'm not sure about big cities, but at least on the countryside, like what is the message that the government is actually sending to people? Because I don't feel like people feel the gravity of the situation today. When we see the numbers keep on going up, and compared to last year, when you go grocery shopping, you still see families grocery shopping together. You still see people gathering at parties and stuff, but they still wear a mask, they wash their hands, but they don't really social distance, And I always wondered, since the Japanese population is very listen to the government in general. I have a feeling that the government is not really telling them, really giving them guidelines such as, hey, yes, you still can go out and stuff, but try not to travel together as a group, as a family, to do basic shopping or things like that. Do you have any take on that? I want to know what message they're actually sending out.
I don't have much to add on that.
They don't, because I feel like the only message that I hear is that, okay, wear a mask, wash your hands, and social distance. But there's no more, and I wonder if they would actually emphasize on the public safety, basically.
Well, the governor of Tokyo has come out very strongly. No drinking. So you can go to a restaurant, but the restaurants aren't going to be serving beer. And close up at 9 o'clock for the restaurants, but also izakaya is, close those things down. Let's just do it for a couple of weeks and see what happens. But I think, yeah, they're taking a much stronger stance. Work from home. Telecommute to the degree that you can, and as you know, people fall in line very quickly here. If the governor says it, people just do it. It doesn't require much more encouragement than that. So I think they are becoming.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And that's what I mean. Like people would follow it, but that's why I wonder, like, why can they just put an announcement saying like, and also because right now they're just putting rules for restaurants and bars and stuff, but also to make people more sensitive on their behavior. Here's the guideline. Try not to gather. Try not to. It's not necessary that you bring the grandpa, the grandma, the wife, the kids to go buy some groceries. things like that, you know, and I never really seen that, and I wonder why the government is not trying to guide people's behavior.
That's interesting because, well, yes, guiding, we probably need to consider, you know, what guiding means and what guidance you know, the government is ready to give. But because, as Timothy said, so the governor of Tokyo, Miss Koike, she actually continues to tell people that, you know, that they should observe the 3 C's. So probably, you know, there is an, let's say, a justification that according to the Japanese constitution, that is the most a government can do. So, well, and I don't know how it is in the area where you live, but in the area where I live, you know, there are constant announcements in the supermarkets and in other stores that people should keep, you know, the physical distance, and they should also wear masks. So in some stores, you're actually not allowed to enter without the masks. And in some parks as well, there are people who, I mean, they are local elderly guys who are volunteers, but when they see young people, you know, partying in the parks, they go up to them and tell them, you know, it's not the time to do it. And then that's what happens. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time, but yes, I think that depending on the place you live, you know, the awareness is even stronger, either stronger or weaker. So probably, you know, it's another way just to, you know, encourage people at a grassroots level to be more careful.
Yeah, I think one of the other aspects of this is compliance. So if the Japanese government pushes too hard or too stringently, they begin to lose that cohesion that they have with the population. That it's too forceful, and I think they don't need to be that forceful. I mean, there was an altercation on the Yamanote train line where somebody was a passenger was there without his mask, and it caused such a controversy inside that they had to stop the train, and this old fellow was removed from the train, and it delayed the departure, which, you know, just totally messes up the entire system. So the Japanese population, you know how it is. Like Maya was saying, you know, you go into the grocery store, you don't have your face mask on, you do get the stinky eye. And so I think that there's a lot of self-administration that's applied here, which seems to be pretty effective, and a lot of countries don't enjoy that cohesion. Harry?
If I may, I'd like to suggest perhaps a topic we could talk about would be the 3 T's, which is tracing, testing, tracing, and treatment. I haven't seen much testing. I'm unaware of the amount of testing that's going on. It seems to have fallen by the wayside, much less the tracing. And I'm wondering if there are more people infected with COVID than not. Perhaps we could talk about that in a future meeting. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and this is completely away from COVID, would be the educational system, and what are the positive and negatives of that, and how can we perhaps contribute to improving it?
Thank you. I took notes. So, okay, it's these topics, I think that tracing, tasting, and treatment, because, well, they are quite relevant to this room at the moment, which is Japanese Politics 101. I'm not sure about education, but we'll see. I guess that, well, in light of public affairs and also probably geopolitical developments, you know, it could be a relevant topic too. Thank you very much, Guy. And with this, if there are no other questions, Ivan, yes?
Hi. Yes, Maya. as a potential topic for the next session, I'm very keen to hear if there's been any update on the development of the new digital agency by the Suga government, what the progress is there.
Good.
And how that relates, to our current topics like management of the vaccine rollout, for example. We can see that this is a paper-based system. The cash handouts, for example, that happened earlier this year were a massive paperwork.
Excellent point.
Yeah, paperwork bottleneck that was created. The vaccine, again, it's a paperwork bottleneck by the local government. So, given the recent reports that Japan is currently 27th in the world in terms of digital readiness, and is being soundly beaten in things like vaccine rollout by countries like, Indonesia, for example, that are doing their vaccine registrations via WhatsApp. I think it's topical and interesting, and I'd love to know if there are any updates on it.
Great topic, and yes, that's good fodder to explore and to discuss. There is movement going on there. A lot of countries are going with the vaccine passport. That is something that, in conjunction with the My Number system here in Japan, is something that could be combined. Let's talk about it next time.
We are looking forward to having you again next week. Thank you.